A television crew encounters a series of inexplicable accidents while filming in the depths of Wookey Hole, a legendary cave system infamous for its eerie apparitions and haunted history. Are these incidents linked to the ghostly figure the director witnessed in the caves a few nights before? Join me as we delve into the shadowy and death-filled caverns of Wookey Hole, with spine-chilling stories of ghosts, curses, and witches, not only in the cave itself, but in the haunted grounds above, including a terrifying haunting in a nearby cottage. And stay tuned as I share at the end a shocking incident that I experienced with my family at Wookey Hole alongside a horrified audience. Could these phenomena be the work of paranormal forces? Well, we're about to find out, because I'm Peter Laws, and it's time to take one last look at the sunlight, because we're about to dive deep into the frightening mysteries and dark secrets of what lies beneath, and the unsettling paranormal mysteries of Wookey Hole. Legend of TV and movie sets being plagued by supernatural activity are not uncommon in the worlds of entertainment. Some of the most notorious examples include The Omen, a 1976 film about the Antichrist, which saw a series of disturbing events including plane crashes, lightning strikes, and crew member accidents. Similarly, The Exorcist, released in 1973, experienced mysterious fires, the deaths of several cast and crew members, the on-screen presence of an actual serial killer as an extra, and other strange occurrences, fueling the idea of cursed sets. Such stories are intriguing, but you can understand why many people dismiss these tales as part of a publicity drive. After all, these are horror films, so what better way of promoting a horror film than claiming the film itself is somehow haunted? Which makes tonight's case only more intriguing, because the eerie happenings on this particular set were not linked to a horror film, and they were never used to promote the production either. They are simply a string of little-known events that might just give you a shiver or two. The weird experiences happened back in 1974, during the production of the BBC TV show Doctor Who. Doctor Who is the longest-running science fiction TV show in the world, and this tale of an intelligent and eccentric alien known as the Doctor, traveling through time in a British police box, has captivated audiences globally since its debut in 1963. It's still running today. The Doctor in Doctor Who goes through various incarnations with different actors and actresses playing the role. So back in 1974, the lead was played by one of the most popular, Tom Baker. In May of that year, the show was in its 12th season, and to help boost ratings, the makers decided to bring back one of the show's most iconic monsters, the Cybermen. I must admit that I found them pretty scary as a kid, though looking at them now, they're a little bit ropey through adult eyes, but man, I was terrified of them as a little boy. During the pre-production stage, extra money was made available to the show, so the scriptwriter Jerry Davis was told it would no longer be filmed on a set alone. They actually had money to go to a real location to depict the story's alien asteroid setting. Now, back then, whenever the BBC wanted to depict an alien land, they would often use a quarry. But the director of these episodes was a man called Michael Bryant, and he wasn't keen. He had a different location in mind. A place in the West Country of England which he had visited with his family in the summer. The place he had in mind was Wookey Hole, which is a small village on the southern edge of the Mendip Hills. The place was then, and still is, famous for its tourist attraction, Wookey Hole Caves. These are a series of extensive limestone caverns that have been used by humans for around 45,000 years. We know that because Paleolithic tools have been found down there, as well as fossilized animals. The caves were formed by the gradual erosion from the River Axe, and this means that it has many subterranean rivers and pools down there. Some parts of the caves are accessible only to experienced cave divers with full underwater breathing equipment, some of whom have tragically lost their lives down there, a detail that will be important, as you'll see later. Why call it Wookey Hole? Well, there are various theories about the name, and no, none of them involve Chewbacca. No, some say Wookey Hole has a Celtic and Anglo-Saxon origin meaning cave, although the general manager of Wookey Hole, Chris Goodchild, says that the word Wookiee may well derive from a word for an animal trap. He said that the Celts used to drive animals off the top of the cave entrance where they would plunge to their deaths, and they would go to the bottom and retrieve the animals for food. Well, back in 1973, the caves were owned by the Madame Tussauds Company, which is famous for its slightly eerie yet still impressive waxwork celebrities. The strangeness began on Tuesday, November the 12th, 1974, when the director, Bryant, had been working on some special effects for the episode. He was filming at something called the BBC Television Centre Puppet Theatre in London. But then, once he was done, he made a 3-hour journey west to Wookey Hole. He travelled alone because his task was pretty simple. He had arranged to walk through the cave systems so that he could map out a shooting schedule, picking which sections of the cave would work for particular scenes in the show. A tech scout like this is a crucial moment before principal photography in any production. After all, you don't want the whole crew and cast waiting around while the director looks around the cave and decides which is the best place for a fight scene. You decide all of that stuff in advance. And so Bryant was doing just that as he travelled there on the Tuesday. He made good time from London, so he arrived at Wookey Hole when the caves were still open to the daily tourist. This was not ideal, because he needed to pace out the shots with nobody present, and so he spoke to the management, who agreed to let him come back later that evening when the caves were closed to the public, and then he could visit at his own leisure alone. Now, Bryant was staying in a nearby hotel. I'd venture a guess it was the Wookey Hole Inn, which was dated back to the 17th century. That was the closest hotel in 1974 before a new one opened in 2010. The new one is famous for its giant witch's hat. Keep witches in mind, because we will return to them soon. Well, Bryant decided he would unpack his stuff, have an evening meal, and then wander back down to the caves when they were empty of visitors to do his full reconnaissance mission. But before he did that, he thought it might be worth his while just to have a brief wander through the caves along with the tourists, just to familiarize himself with the place. It was during this walkthrough that he made a remarkable discovery, one that he would come to regret. Michael Bryant was walking through one of the underground chambers when he stumbled across some strange artifacts lying on the dusty floor. He dropped down to the ground to examine them and was surprised to pick up a number of stone arrowheads and a stone scraper. These items would have dated back to the Iron Age, and yet they were just lying around. Why hadn't any tourists noticed them? Well, perplexed but excited, he decided to pocket these treasures. They would make a great souvenir of his work down here in the caves. Well, once he'd walked through, he left with the general public and just headed up to the hotel, those old stone arrowheads rattling in his pocket. And he had no idea that the time would come when he would believe that moving these items would set in motion a series of frightening and eerie events. Well, later that night, Bryant finished his hotel meal. Perhaps he was looking from the window, watching the cars of the tourists drive off to their homes, their cozy homes in the night. But then when it was clear that the last of them had gone, it was time to get to work. He grabbed his shooting script, a notepad and a pen, and he made his way across the empty car park and walked the dark, shadowy night walk to the mouth of the cave. He met the cave manager, and they agreed that Bryant would spend the rest of the entire evening inside the vast caverns alone. That would give him as much time as he needed to plan out the Cybermen episode. Before he went into the cave manager leaned in and told him, "Look, mate, we'll leave the lighting on for you, but we're gonna have to lock you in." Now, Bryant might have been startled at this, but he soon realized it made sense. They'd have to lock both the exits and entrance because otherwise members of the public could literally just turn up and go inside without permission, without payment. It was dangerous down there too, and they did not have staff to monitor anyone going in and out without authorization. Indeed, the manager actually said he wasn't going to wait at the door for him. He had other things to do. And so, he said he would lock Bryant inside the cave and head off. But there was a bell at the entrance, and when Bryant was done, he just had to get to the locked door, hit the bell, and the manager would hear it and come and let him out. Now, Bryant seemed happy with this arrangement, gave him the thumbs up, and as far as I know, he made no mention of the artifacts he had found and taken earlier that evening. Bryant stepped inside and heard the heavy door clatter behind him, and he was now alone in the cold caves. I've been down in Wookey Hole caves more than once, so I know how much reverberation there is down there. So I'm pretty sure he would have heard the turn of the locks and bolts echoing through this cavern as he set off his slow and focused walk through the cave system. Now, if you walk through the caves of Wookey Hole on a guided tour, you'll be walking for just under 1 kilometers, with 3 large chambers. So it's big. But that distance is deceptive because the place is actually much bigger than it looks. You see, there's only a very small portion that is open to the public. The caverns are among the largest in Britain, and explorers have mapped out approximately so far 4,000 meters of passageways, which includes 25 different chambers at least. So those places are not available to the public. So as Bryant made his slow walk through, he would not be able to see the vast areas of unseen spaces just beyond the darkness. And there really are a shocking amount of hidden spaces in these caves. Just last month, I was in a huge underground cave system in Budapest, and I would look around this cave thinking that's all there was, until my guide would point to a tiny hole or crack in the wall, and he would shine his torch and say, "There's something beyond that, you know." I remember one when he said that some caver had pushed through a hole many years ago, and this made me squirm because the hole he's pointed to that this caver, a woman, had crawled through was tiny. But then he added that the hole I was looking at had since been cut even more, and when she had originally pushed herself through it, it was half of that size. I realized then that actually there was a vast, gaping, unseen chamber behind what to me looked like tiny cracks or crevices. And so when Bryant walked through the cave, probably with his coat on because it gets chilly down there, he might have no idea that those little shadowy moments that he would spot beyond that could be a vast chasm. The temperature remains at a relatively constant 11 degrees Celsius, 53 degrees Fahrenheit down there. So regardless of the weather up top, it's pretty chilly. It's like its own world. Well, Bryant made good progress and found some great rock corridors and an underground lake in Chamber 3. He thought that would be a perfect setting for one of the scenes with the lead actress. Little did he know how badly that would go when he actually got to it in a few days' time, but I digress. He was pleased. The caves were perfect for depicting the inside of an alien asteroid, and he had spent quite a while down there because it wasn't until 11 p.m. that he realized he was ready to start wrapping up. He made some final notes and then began to prepare to leave. He paused in the passageway, the one that leads down from the cave entrance, and he was finishing up his script, which is when it happened. For hours in the cave, all had been normal, but now something shifted. He started to notice something, a sound that he had not heard the entire time he had been there tonight. It was movement. He could hear it growing louder and louder, as clear as day. It was the sound of footsteps crunching along the sandy floor of the cave. Someone was walking towards it. Now, naturally, Bryant assumed this was the manager. Maybe the manager was impatient and wanted to go home. Now it was getting late, and he'd come down to hurry Bryant up. Only he started to see soon that it was not the cave manager, not at all. You see, as Bryant squinted his eyes into the darkness, he saw what was making those footsteps. He saw a figure striding through the cave, and it looked like... Wait, Bryant looked close. Yes, it looked like a stranger was dressed in underwater diving gear, but more specifically, cave diving gear, like scuba tanks, regulators, lights, dry suit, cutting tools hanging from the belt. Bryant watched this man approaching, and whether he called out to the stranger or not is unknown. I just know that the diver walked straight past him, and Bryant turned to watch him head down into the shadows. It was clear that this person was walking towards the first deep subterranean water pool down there. Now, Bryant shrugged. He knew full well that the caverns were a popular site for cave explorers. Yet it did seem odd that a diver should be heading down for a dive at this late hour, and alone too. But then he figured, well, maybe divers can't come down when the public are here, so maybe it's natural that they come in after dark, after hours, just like I'm in after hours. Well, he made some final script notes, then gathered up his stuff, and he made his way back up the passageway that the diver had just walked down. He headed towards the entrance door and went to open it, and it was still locked. Oh, the cave manager must have locked it behind the diver when he let him in, just as he locked it behind Brian when he came in. Okay, well, Brian rang the bell and waited, gazing back down the dark passageway, wondering if the diver was under the cold water yet, of how kind of strange and spooky it is to think of him being utterly alone down there in the deep and genuinely dangerous pools of this place. Well, eventually the cave manager arrived, and Brian heard the bolts sliding back, and he stepped out into the cold November night air. And the manager probably asked how it went. Fine, Brian said, I've planned out the whole shoot. But then Brian added something as they headed back down the path towards the hotel. He said, "Hey, I was surprised to see that caver down there." The manager stopped and turned his head and said, "Pardon?" Brian goes, the caver, the one with the diving gear. He's down there right now. You must have let him in. The manager shook his head. "Ah," Brian said, "then one of your colleagues must have let him in, because he's right. Mr. Brian." The manager leaned in. "There are absolutely no cave dives planned for tonight. I would know. I can assure you that you were the only one down there tonight." Brian frowned and glanced back up at the cave, his mind starting to race with confusion and alarm. Who was that he had just clearly seen walking right next to him? Well, Bryant would learn that he was not the only one to have witnessed a phantom diver in the caverns. Several others had seen him too, and they even knew his name. They were convinced that it was the spirit of James Gordon Ingram Marriott. Back in April 1949, 2 cave divers were exploring the underwater cave systems in Wookey Hole. One was called Robert Davies, and the other was called James Gordon Ingram Marriott. Marriott was a talented and experienced underwater diver with 500 diving hours to his name. He was also an ex-member of the Royal Marines. In preparation for this episode, I was able to speak to James Gordon's son, John Ingram Marriott. He pointed out that from age 17 to 21, his dad had operated Sleeping Beauties during his Royal Marine training, which are motorized submersible canoes. He said his dad was a real character. After the war, he was demobbed and worked at a holiday camp called Butlins as a redcoat, and his party trick, listen to this, was to dive off the high board and disappear through a large drain in the deep end of the pool and then reappear at the back of the crowd some minutes later, scaring everyone to death. Well, while James had much training with the Royal Marines, he had limited experience of diving in underground cave systems, which is a very specific skill. On Saturday, 9th of April of 1949, the 2 men were deep in the caves of Wookey Hole and had just visited a remote section called the 9th Chamber. This is one of the flooded caves accessible only to expert divers. The 2 men swam in the water where visibility could be pretty reasonable since the limestone helps filtrate the water, but you have to be very careful not to disturb the bottom sediment. Kicking that up will cause visibility to drop significantly. But even without the sediment, you have to remember the cave divers are doing this underground, which means there are no electric lights and certainly no natural light. They can't see a thing without torches and lights. So the 2 men looked at each other and gave themselves the thumbs up. It was time to leave. They'd set out a guideline, which is essential when diving, since it's so easy to lose track of where you are. I spoke to a very experienced cave diver in that cave in Budapest last week, and he said how scarily easy it is to completely lose your sense of direction. Think about it, you're in a cave floating underwater, and one wrong turn and you can't tell which way is left, right, or even up or down. And so the guideline is crucial for their safety. Well, Marriott and Davies both grabbed the line and started to work their way along out of the 9th chamber. Marriott took the lead. It was while they were tugging themselves along the guide rope when Davies suddenly got into difficulties. For a moment, he thought his light had gone out, which is a terrifying experience in an underwater cave. Let's picture that for a moment. But no, the light hadn't actually gone off, but rather, I think it had become covered in some sort of thick mud. So he managed to wipe it away and could see again. So he set off and pulled himself back along, assuming that Marriott must be pretty far ahead by now. He moved onward and tragically found Marriott's body floating in the water. He was dead. His equipment was examined, and it was discovered that the contents gauge on his tanks and the red breather was faulty, which had caused him to run out of oxygen. It was a tragic and unnecessary death. James Gordon Ingram Marriott became the first person to die on a cave dive in Britain. It's just a reminder that behind many of these paranormal stories are real people and real loss. Ingram Marriott was only 24 when he died. Well, as the years passed after this, rumors began of people in Wookey Hole seeing the figure of a diver walking through the caverns. And maybe if Michael Bryant had heard that story just a few days ago, he would have dismissed it as a fun, maybe silly legend, perhaps designed to attract tourists. But as he settled into bed that night in the Wookey Hole Inn, he could not get it out of his head. There had been a man down there, a diver in full equipment, not leaving the place but heading down to the deep water alone. And as Bryant drifted into an unsettled sleep with the stone arrowheads lying somewhere in the room, he pondered the simple but unavoidable fact. He would have to return to those caves next week for the actual shoot. Well, if he thought a phantom diver was all he had to worry about, he had another thing coming, because something even more perplexing was awaiting both him and the crew down there in the deep and yet not so silent caves. It was Monday, the 18th of November, 1974, when the BBC trucks, cars and vans rolled into Wookey Hole. They carried cameras, lights, sound, equipment, props, costumes, and of course the crew and cast, including the main stars of the show, Tom Baker, Elizabeth Sladen, and Ian Marter. The plan was to shoot for 4 days in the caves of Wookey Hole. That was Monday to Thursday, and then they would head back to London on the Friday. Now, of course, they expected some challenges. Doctor Who is and was then an ambitious show to film, even in a studio, with its inventive special effects. And so filming underground would be a new experience for the crew, but this particular shoot would end up becoming one of the most eventful in the program's long history. Events that the director Bryant would believe were caused by his taking of the stone artifacts. They had 2 small boats, each with outboard motors. They were to be used in some important shots, with characters chugging across the surface of the underground pools. But it was weird, because those boat motors had been working perfectly when used in a previous shoot. So why were they now suddenly failing down there in the caves? Because of these boat issues, the cast and crew found themselves sitting around a lot, waiting for them to be fixed. One of those waiting was a man called Jack Wells. He dealt with the firearms on the production. For some reason, he found himself suddenly becoming very unwell down there, as if the strange atmosphere of the caves had affected him somewhat, and he ended up getting so ill that he had to be sent home, and a replacement armorer was dispatched. He would not be the only one who fell ill in the crew. The assistant floor manager was a woman called Rosemary Hester. She had been working in the cave when she was suddenly overwhelmed with a panicked and cloying sense of claustrophobia. She couldn't take it, and she started freaking out suddenly that she couldn't handle the space down there, and she too had to be walked out and replaced. This caused even more delays to the schedule, but some of the most dramatic problems came when a crew member encountered another supernatural being down there in the caves. Not the diver this time, but a witch. There is a section of the caves called Chamber 3, also known as the Witch's Parlour, and another called Chamber 1, which is better known as the Witch's Kitchen. The latter contains a striking stalagmite formation which is known as the Witch of Wookey Hole. There are legends that say this stalagmite is actually the petrified remains of an evil witch. There's various versions of this story. One says that 1,000 years ago, a witch lived in the cave, along with a dog and 2 familiar spirits. That's supernatural companions in the form of a small animal. One was a goat, and the other was the goat's offspring, its kid. This witch had once been happy in love in the outside world, it was told, but then she was betrayed by her lover. Heartbroken and bitterly angry, she retreated to the cave to wallow in her hatred, not only of the man who hurt her, but of any happy couple. She was so polluted by her fury that she would send out curses to the locals. At one point, she was said to have even caused the death of a child through her bitterness. This caused the terrified villagers to contact the abbot of Glastonbury. He sent a monk down into the caves to confront the witch. She tried to escape him, but he sprinkled some holy water, and she was petrified into the stone we see today. Not only that, her dog was turned to stone too. And you can see that in the caves as well, forever condemned to mournfully look in the same direction. Bones have been found scattered around this dog's stone, which some say came from locals offering them to the dog to appease the vengeful spirit of the witch. Now, of course, stories of witches being turned to stone at the hands of mighty clergymen might sound either like storybook legends or church propaganda to bolster their followers. But there are reasons to believe that there really was a witch who lived in the cave at some point. In 1912, an excavation led by a local archaeologist called Herbert Balch uncovered the bones of a Romano-British woman, and next to her were the bones of a goat and its kid. A black bowl, a brooch, a weaving comb, and what looked like a chunk of stalagmite that had been polished into a smooth ball, a crystal ball, it was wondered. Balch also found a latch, which suggested that at one point whoever had lived down there had fitted some sort of door, a door they wanted to close and keep closed. They also found an iron sickle and a knife in the pit along with the human bones. Was this proof that a witch really did live in the caves all those years ago? Well, critics of the idea sometimes point to the analysis of the bones, which suggests that these were actually the skeleton of a man, not a woman. For some people, that instantly destroys the story of a witch being down there, which frankly only illustrates the inherent gender stereotypes that seem locked in people's heads, that witches must be female. No, they can be male. Whatever the case, though, you can see the remains of the witch herself at the Wells and Mendip Museum in Wells, Somerset. But what cannot be denied is that the talk of a witch has persisted in the caves and chilled people for centuries. And we see that even carved on the walls themselves. In 2017, some of the staff from Wookey Hole were working in the caves when they discovered strange marks on the wall. They were soon confirmed as witch marks. Witch marks are symbols or scratches scrawled on walls and doorways to protect people from witches. These marks at Wookey were dated between 1550 and 1750, and there was a lot of them, 57 in total. They were the largest collection of witch marks in a British cave until 2019, when an even bigger concentration of witch marks were discovered at Creswell Crags. There were hundreds of them found there, scraped over walls and ceilings, and I find this creepy, scraped and scratched over large crevices and dark seams in the cave, as if people were putting them for protection there because they feared that a witch might come crawling out of those dark holes. Were the people who feared witches in Creswell Crags and Wookey Hole just superstitious and wanted to cover their bases just in case, or did they put those marks on the cave walls because they had genuinely experienced encounters with frightening supernatural entities that they labeled as witches? I don't know. But as we return now to the Doctor Who shoot, we'll see the troubles become even worse and that it could well be connected with the Witch of Wookey Hole. The shoot for Revenge of the Cybermen had already been plagued with strange activity, from unexpected equipment malfunctions to sudden illnesses, and not least from the director, Michael Bryant, witnessing a phantom diver walking towards the dive pool. Well, things would get even worse as the shoot went on, and the catalyst appears to have been a prank by a crew member. The eerie stalagmite formation known as the Witch of Wookey Hole prompts a certain amount of superstition even today. Tour guides in the cave have been heard to warn tourists, don't touch it. It might disturb the witch still trapped inside. On the third day of filming back in 1974, an electrician on the Doctor Who crew spotted this petrified witch and decided to have a bit of a laugh. He grabbed a few different costume items from the BBC prop store, a black cloak, and a black pointed hat, and he draped the cloak around the stone and tugged the hat on top of the cold head. And he stood back for a giggle at the witch. The danger began almost immediately after. There was a scene in the story that took place in the witch's parlor, chamber number 3. In the past, this area was deep under the ocean, and the shells from all the sea creatures settled on the ocean bed and formed the hardened rock that you can see there today. Today, there is a deep pool of water in it. Back in 1974, the crew were using this cave for a relatively simple scene. The actress Elizabeth Sladen was to sit on one of the boats, the ones with the motor on it, that they'd finally got working, and she was going to float out onto the water. This was very soon after the electrician had dressed up the witch. Sladen climbed into the boat, and they pushed her gently into the middle of the water with the onboard engine running, but then the engine just surged and went out of control. The crew looked on in horror as a panicked Sladen sped off towards the far side of the cavern. Now, you've got to appreciate how dangerous this is. The cavern walls down there aren't flat. They are shelved, with sharp, jagged edges leaning over the water. So as the boat went to hammer towards one of these walls, Sladen saw that while the tip of the boat might hit the wall first, the overhang may well slam into her face and her body and do serious damage. Or worse, there was no other option. She leapt out of the boat and crashed into the cold water and immediately struggled. It happened very fast. The crew stuntman, Terry Walsh, could see that she was in danger of drowning, and he leapt into the sump and frantically swam towards her. He managed to save her life and swam back to the edge, pulling a thoroughly shaken Sladen out of the cold water. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. She was shocked but safe. But then, very soon after that, Terry Walsh became ill. So badly, in fact, that he could no longer stay on the set. He had to return to the hotel nearby so he could rest and recover from whatever had come over him. Was it something in the water? Well, if so, why was Elizabeth Sladen okay and he wasn't? The problems just kept on coming. Remember the electrician who was the one who dressed up the stalagmite as a witch? On the same day as the boating accident, the same day he did the witch costume, he was setting up a lighting effect for which he had to climb up a ladder. He was up there getting things in place when suddenly his foot just slipped. He came toppling off the ladder. He smashed down onto the cave floor and his leg was broken. He too had to leave the cave and stop working on the shoot. He was carried out on a stretcher. The filming had started on Monday, the 18th of November, but by 21st, a Thursday, the visual effects assistant, Tony Harding, was baffled by his pyrotechnic equipment. It just kept malfunctioning, and he couldn't understand why. All of this kit had been pre-tested in a rehearsal back at BBC Studios in London. Why was it suddenly faulty now, along with so many other things? Was it just the natural environmental factors of the cave, or was it just another example of equipment malfunctioning during paranormal events, which is a phenomenon that is often reported? Well, the filming packed up on the Thursday, and the crew went back to the hotel to rest. They all left on the Friday. The final scenes of the episode would be filmed at Television Centre in December. And the strange issues that had plagued the set stopped completely once they were away from those caves. And they wrapped up the filming the next month with no further problems, and the episodes were broadcast in April 1975. And yet, the director, Michael Bryant, still felt uneasy. You see, while the production had gone well after leaving Wookey Hole, Bryant's personal life had not. He had always thought of himself as a lucky person where things would go his way more often than not. Yet since his time in the caves, his life had just begun throwing up a barrage of personal problems that lasted for several weeks. And as the issues kept coming, he started to wonder if the problem might lie not in some guy dressing up a thing as a witch, but rather in what he took from the cave. He still had those Iron Age artifacts, the arrowheads and the stones that he found on that very first night in the cave. He had taken them as a memento, but as he sat there staring at them, thinking about all of the challenges he had faced on the set and now in his own life, not to mention the mysterious diver he'd seen walking past him on the night he'd taken those artifacts. He came to one simple but wild conclusion, that there may be something strange and powerful about these items, that they gave off an uneasy energy, and he realized that he wouldn't feel comfortable until he had gotten rid of them. He said this to a paranormal researcher called Paul Adams.
I am not a very superstitious person, but the filming problems, followed by other problems at home, made me wonder. In the end, I put them in the dustbin, back in the days when they were emptied weekly. I knew they would end up in a landfill one day, so somebody else might find them. But within a week, I started to become a lucky person again, although I was sad to have disposed of such interesting and precious things.
Well, Bryant isn't the only one who has run into seemingly supernatural things down in Wookey Hole, because there is an entire array of paranormal reports from this area. And is that any wonder, when there are so many dead people down there? When families visit Wookey Hole, they marvel at the beauty of the underground cave system, but many of them don't realize that they might be walking in a graveyard. There's evidence of a Romano-British cemetery located deep inside the fourth chamber. The area is inaccessible to the public, and it was discovered during the 1950s. Up until then, human remains were often found scattered around the cave. But when they found the cemetery down there, they realized that many of these bones must have been coming from there. Radiocarbon dating estimates that the underground graveyards date between the Iron Age and the Roman Empire. Is that why strange noises have been heard in the caves for years? It's often reported that it is the sound of distant, mournful moaning. Footsteps have been heard when there are no people to make them. You could say the moaning is just potentially air pressure changes or wind whistling through tight passages. Indeed, in ancient times, the Romans used to visit these caves, and they believed the gods were speaking to them down there, when it could well have just been the sound of the water levels fluctuating and making incredible sounds. Footsteps, I suppose, could be dripping water misheard. Cave formations do have a weird resonance. They can act like natural amplifiers. For example, when I was in the caves of Budapest that I mentioned last month, my guide demonstrated the unique sound qualities of the cave by whispering to me, but he was standing quite far away, and yet I could hear it. But it's not just sounds, is it? Visitors to the cave, like Bryant, have sometimes reported seeing things. Others have been nudged or pushed as they walked through the cavern. Some have said they've seen dark shadows that they assume are openings or crevices, but then those shadows move quickly, flitting away as if something curious was hurrying through, watching them. One person who knows a thing or two about the ghosts down there is Chris Goodchild. Chris started working in Wookey Hole in May of 2000 as a general assistant. He was cleaning tables, but since then he's worked his way up to become the general manager of the caves. So that's 24 years of knowledge about that system. He spoke to the Haunted History podcast in 2023. He says that they regularly have bones washing up from the different hidden chambers. The divers will often come back with a hyena's tooth or a skull. They were just floating silently in the water for centuries until they happened to slide through a crevice or a diver noticed it. He's walked through that cave system more than most, and he feels very relaxed in the caverns. Chris says he'll quite happily walk through the caves in the middle of the night with all the lights off. But all that changes in one area, Chamber 3. That's the place, he says, where he personally feels very uneasy when he senses the hair on the back of his neck rise, along with a heavy feeling of otherness, weirdness, of presence. Chamber 3 is right next to the ancient burial ground, and it's the Witch's Parlour, the location where Elizabeth Sladen almost drowned after the boating accident back in '74. Chris says he gets lots of stories from guests who have experienced something odd down there. For example, at one time a guest had gotten themselves lost in the caves, but they came across a diver down there who looked a bit confused. The visitor spoke to the diver and told him that, they were lost, and asked if the diver knew how to get out. So even though the diver looked a bit confused himself, he did point the guest in the right direction. And then the guest was able to find their way out without an issue. And as they were leaving, they happened to walk past a staff member. And they just leaned over to the staff member and said, "Hey, do you mind just passing on your thanks to the diver who helped us get out? I really appreciated it." The worker stared back at this guest, confused, and said, "There are no divers booked in that day, none whatsoever." So reminiscent of what happened to Bryant. On another occasion, Chris said that a local police officer arrived at the caves because the police had received a 999 call from someone saying they were currently stuck down a well at Wookey Hole. The police didn't know if it was a prank call or not, but they wanted to check just in case. Chris confirmed to the police that there was nobody in the caves at the time and that they didn't even have a well anyway. But they did discover later that a young boy had been trapped in the caves, apparently, and had died there. Chris said people started linking those two events. And yet the caves are not the only place where paranormal activity has been reported. The surrounding land and estate has been the site of some hair-raising events. For example, Chris Goodchild said that when he was younger, he was helping close up the gift shop that they have on site, which is now an ice cream parlor, by the way. He said that there were a display of candles on a shelf which were suddenly thrown across the room for absolutely no reason. There was no wind, nobody near them to pull them off, but he said those candles were launched across the gift shop. Chris says that they didn't stay to investigate. He and the other staff just got out of there. They were so shaken by it, they could deal with it in the morning. I get that. For me, however, one of the most compelling of paranormal cases at Wookey Hole took place in a cottage on the site. And it's the stuff of nightmares. The cottage was built in 1870 and it had one tenant for almost 70 years. She lived there without electricity and was happy to use candlelight to find her way around in the dark. She eventually died in 1947, aged 80. Now that she was dead, they decided to rent the house out to another tenant. But the house needed modernizing with running water and electrical power. There were no reports of paranormal activity in the house until these renovations took place. But once they were done and the new tenants moved in, unsettling events began. The first to move in was a young couple with their 8-year-old son. They were very happy there for the first few months. But then one evening, after the young boy had been sent off to sleep for the night, the parents heard his little feet hammering down the stairs. He ran into them, breathless and terrified. The mother asked him what on earth was wrong, and he simply asked her this: "Who is the old lady upstairs?" His mother was confused and told him straight, "There's no old lady upstairs. You must be dreaming." This sentence did nothing for the panic on his face. He insisted he had just seen an old woman, and he added this detail, that she was wearing a cap and a white apron, and that she was in his bedroom right now. The mother was confused and knew she'd have to head upstairs to show the boy that it really was just a dream. And so she walked up the staircase, ready to dismiss it all, when she froze. There before her eyes was an elderly lady walking across the landing. And then she was gone. Astonished, the mother turned to her son, who had clearly been telling the truth, and he was so frightened, as was she, no doubt, that she was quite happy when he demanded that he sleep in her bed that night. As the months went by, the family would hear footsteps going down the stairs and clumping up them again, and they would see the old woman on several other frightening occasions. After a while, the haunting simply became too relentless, too scary, and the family had enough. They moved out. The next tenants moved in, and they too experienced uncanny events. They heard the phantom footsteps again up and down the stairs, but they would also see the lights switching on and off in the middle of the night. And in one particularly freaky part of the haunting, they said the wooden doors of the cottage would sometimes visibly bulge, like an invisible pressure was pushing at them from the other side, and then suddenly the doors would fling open, slam wide. There was nothing behind them, but they would slam shut again. She was seen again too, this old lady, on multiple occasions by the new tenants. They saw her walking around the cottage just like she had always done for the last 70 years in the dark. Only this time, the witnesses said that the apparition of the lady brought with her a terrible coldness in the air, as well as a repulsive smell that was described by witnesses as the stench of a decaying body from a coffin. Well, in 1950, the cottage was converted by knocking through the walls into the adjoining house, and the other home in the cottage created a big enough space to convert into accommodation for the restaurant staff at Wookey Hole. None of this seemed to deter the supernatural force, however, because more incidents would follow. For example, one night a female employee was sleeping in her room on the site when something roused her from sleep. And when she opened her eyes in the dark bedroom, she saw a sight that chilled her to the core. An apparition of an elderly woman was entering the room through the wall, and she watched it walk across her bedroom. Incidents like this became so bad for the staff that the catering manager was just getting sick of the staff turning up in her office saying that they couldn't stay in the staff accommodation. The manager did not believe in ghosts and was convinced a rational explanation could be found, and to prove it, she announced that she would sleep in the converted cottage herself as a way of dampening down the hysteria about this haunting. Not only that, she would spend the night there, alone. The night came. She hadn't been in there for long before she started to question her skepticism. For a start, she felt an atmosphere in the cottage that left her feeling weirdly unsettled, so much so that she struggled to sleep that night. But things grew much worse when she began hearing strange noises from inside the room, noises that soon turned into whispering. Frozen in the bed, she had the unshakable sensation that there was something, or rather someone, in the dark room with her. And the feeling and the sounds became unbearable, and she leapt out of bed and rushed to get an assistant manager. The two women then returned to the cottage and searched it thoroughly to find what had been making this strange noise. Could it even be a staff member playing a prank? They found nothing out of the ordinary. All was as it should be. The manager did not want to give in to her feelings of unease, and perhaps she told herself that she had been imagining it after all. But whatever the case, she gave permission for the assistant manager to leave and go back to work, and the manager trudged back up the stairs to the bed and climbed back in. Yet as she slipped into the cold covers, the feeling of dread and presence came back. She lay there, wishing the feeling away, and eventually managed to fall asleep. That was until just after 2 a.m., when she was shocked awake by the undeniable sensation of a hand, a cold and bony hand, mind you, grasping her shoulder in the bed. The feeling was so horrifying that she sprang herself upright and looked around the room, reaching for the bedside lamp, knowing that when she flooded the room with light, she would see it was empty and that any nightmares of a cold hand would quickly fade under the electric light. But she clicked the lamp and turned back to the room. Then there was a woman standing across from the bed. To her absolute horror, she saw the woman just standing there staring at her. The door of the bedroom was fully closed, so it appeared that this woman had walked through the door. With all doubt gone, the manager let out a piercing scream that could wake the dead. Well, it certainly seemed to wake this one, because this cold and bony spectre drifted away at the sound of her shriek, and it vanished through the opposite wall. The manager leapt out of bed, scrambled through the door and down the stairs, racing out, and once she was free of that place, she told anyone who would listen she would never, ever set foot in that place again. The haunting of the Wookey Cottage had started in 1948, a year after the old woman had died, and by the summer of 1952, 23 separate people had claimed to have experienced paranormal activity in that cottage, and a remarkable 7 of those had reported seeing the frightening apparition of an old woman. After nearly 5 years of strange reports, the cottage caught the attention of some locals from the spiritualist church. Curious and wanting to help, they offered to carry out vigils at the cottage. If they made contact with the old woman, they may be able to understand why she was not at rest and clinging on to a house she had lived in for almost 70 years. I should imagine that some of these local spiritualists may well have even known this old lady in life. The vigils, however, did not achieve anything. That was until 1954 when Wing Commander Gerard Hodgkinson called in the local vicar. Hodgkinson's family had owned the Wookey Caves and surrounding land for centuries, and they were the ones who had opened the cave as a tourist attraction. The vicar arrived at the cottage and carried out an exorcism ritual. I don't know what happened. Perhaps it was uneventful or even sedate. Some exorcisms often are. But the result was profound. Once the exorcism was complete, there were no more reports of strange sounds or spectral old women. The haunting, it seemed, was over, and the elderly lady who had clung on to that house for 70 years before death, and 5 extra years after death, had finally moved on. The same cannot be said of another building on the site, where reports of activity continue to this day. There was a mill on the Wookey Hole site way back in 1086, but that was for making flour. Yet Wookey Hole became far better known for its paper mill, which opened in 1610. They would use the fresh water from the caves to make the paper, and it was a huge success. It became one of the most important paper mills in Europe, though the factory fires were an issue. But one of the darkest aspects of that mill was how they used child labour in Victorian times, which was not unheard of in Britain. They used children because of their small size, because a little kid could be sent inside the machines to pull bits of paper and rags that were stuck and causing a jam. Wookey Hole cave manager Chris Goodchild says that multiple children were either maimed, crushed, or killed during this process. So perhaps it's no surprise to find that the mill is now considered to be seriously haunted, with witnesses claiming to see not only shadowy figures flitting around the mill, but also the sound of agonized screams from children. Witnesses have even seen apparitions of children walking the mill, which has now got lots of different tourist attractions in it. There have also been reports of an angry male entity that stalks the place and is known to push people over. Now, I'm not making this up, and it could well be a coincidence. But this is where I want to share one final thing. Something that happened to me when I visited Wookey Hole with my family some years ago. Not the biggest thing in the world, but something I know I will never, ever forget. Back in 2016, I visited Wookey Hole with my family. At that point, it was owned by the circus promoter called Jerry Cottle. It still is. When I went, Jerry Cottle was still alive, though he had since died in 2021. When we went there, they were running a circus show on stage with acrobatics and stunts. This happens in the paper mill, this place where the angry entity has been reported, the one that shoves people. I've had no knowledge of something that pushes people around there until I just discovered it when I was editing this afternoon. Anyway, I was with the kids watching the circus show, which is apparently in the same area as this shoving thing has been mentioned, I now discover. And I do remember that the people on stage were very young, teens or in their 20s as I recall. And one young woman was either up on a platform or a swing, I can't quite remember. All I know is she was definitely elevated, because what happened next I can't get out of my head. She looked fine on whatever platform she was on, but then suddenly she just seemed to jerk and then fall, and she put out her arms to stop herself, as people do, and no joke, she slammed into the stage in front of everybody, and she let out this awful scream, and she broke her arm right in front of us all. It was wild. I've seen that sort of thing on internet video clips, but not in real life. People came rushing out on the stage. The show was called off. I can still feel how much everyone's faces were wincing and just how uncomfortable it was. The sound of her hitting the stage, her screaming. I've always assumed she just fell, and maybe she just fell. But then today, at the last minute, I hear for the first time of an angry entity shoving people in that exact area. Well, it gave me one final shiver anyway. And so with that, we come to the end of our deep dive into Wookey Hole, a place that is filled with so much ancient history and death that it's little wonder that locals and visitors have had a sense of something reaching out from beyond, both above the surface and deep in the caverns below. For many, the unexplained events of Wookey Hole might just sound like a fairy tale, a legend told to excite tourists or boost visitor numbers. But for people like Michael Bryant, who saw a series of strange events and even a sighting of a diver in a supposedly empty cave, there remains a persistent sense that there might be shadows within the shadows down there. That the stories we tell one another about these places can be like caves themselves. They may seem relatively shallow, and yet what happens if there are deeper chambers inside them? What if the stories of Wookey Hole may be more than just stories? What happens if you might find in the cracks of those tales moments of genuine supernatural encounter? And with so much more to explore in those caverns, who knows what might yet be discovered, uncovered, or unleashed in the cave systems beneath our feet. I'm Peter Lawson. You've been listening to What Lies Beneath the Unsettling Paranormal Mysteries of Wookey Hole.